On the evening of March 9th, 1976, high above the snowy slopes of northern Italy, a cable car began what should have been a short and ordinary ride down from Mount Cermis. For the people inside, there was nothing unusual about it. They were tired from a day of skiing. Some were children on a school trip. Some were tourists heading back toward their hotels. Outside the windows, the Dolomites stretched across the fading light, cold and beautiful, the kind of view people came to Cavalese to remember. But within minutes, that quiet descent would turn into the deadliest cable car disaster in history. And what made the tragedy even harder to accept was not only the number of lives lost. It was the fact that the system had tried to stop itself before the disaster happened. The warning had come. The machinery had reacted. The danger had been detected. For one brief moment, the people inside the cabin were still alive because the safety system had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Then, someone restarted the line. Cavalese was a town built beneath mountains that seemed almost too beautiful to be dangerous. Sitting in the Val di Fiemme, surrounded by the Dolomites, it had become a popular winter destination by the 1970s. Ski tourism brought people into the valley every season. Hotels filled, restaurants served visitors late into the evening. Streets that might have been quiet in another town became busy with skiers carrying poles, boots, and equipment through the snow. Above them all was Mount Cermis, and connecting the mountain to the town was a cable car system that people trusted without thinking too much about it. That trust is important to understand. Most passengers do not step into a cable car and wonder how much strain is being placed on the steel above them. They do not calculate the speed of the cabin as it passes a tower. They do not ask whether the operator has been trained for the exact emergency that might happen that day. They simply board, look out the window, and assume that every hidden part of the system has already been checked by someone else. For years, that assumption seemed reasonable. Cable cars were part of mountain life. They carried skiers up, brought them back down, and helped turn small alpine towns into tourist economies. The ride itself could feel calm, almost effortless. A cabin would leave the station, glide across the slope, pass above the trees, and arrive minutes later. But behind that simple experience was a system that depended on balance. The cabin was supported by a fixed cable, a heavy steel line holding the weight of the car above the valley. Another cable moved through the system and pulled the cabin along its route. These two cables had different jobs, and under normal conditions, they were never supposed to fight each other. They worked together, but they had to remain in the right place. If they crossed, rubbed, or overlapped in the wrong way, the danger could become severe very quickly. That was why the system had safety features. If something abnormal happened, the line could stop. The machine could pause. Operators could investigate before the situation became worse. But safety systems only work when people still respect them. But over time, at Mount Cermis, that respect appears to have weakened. The ski resort was busy. Queues were long. Visitors wanted to get up and down the mountain quickly, and every minute mattered when hundreds of people were waiting in the cold. In that kind of environment, pressure begins to shape decisions. Not always in one dramatic moment, and not always because someone intends to be reckless. Sometimes it happens slowly. A procedure is adjusted. A warning is dismissed. A limit is stretched because yesterday nothing bad happened. Then it is stretched again because the system still seems to work. The cable car line was reportedly operated faster than the manufacturer had intended, especially near parts of the route where the cabin should have slowed down. Those slow sections were not just for comfort. They helped reduce strain and movement as the car passed over support structures. But when speed becomes a priority, safety margins can start to look like delays. This is how a disaster can begin long before anyone hears a snap, sees sparks, or watches a cabin fall. It begins in the ordinary decisions that slowly teach people to ignore the very things designed to protect them. On the Cermis line, automatic stops had happened before. The moving cable could come into contact with a support cable, and when it did, the safety system would shut the line down. At first, that kind of stop should have been treated as a serious warning. But if a warning happens again and again, and each time nothing terrible follows, people can become used to it. The alarm becomes annoying instead of frightening. The shutdown becomes a delay instead of a sign of danger. And once that mindset takes hold, the most dangerous sentence in any control room becomes very easy to believe. It has happened before, and everything was fine. One of the men working in that system was Carlo Schweitzer, a young seasonal operator. He was not a veteran cableway engineer. He was not a deeply experienced technician who had spent years studying every failure mode of the line. He was a young worker placed in a position where calm judgment and proper training mattered enormously. That distinction does not erase responsibility, but it does change how the tragedy should be understood. The disaster was not simply the story of one man making one bad decision in isolation. It was the story of a workplace where bad habits had become normal, where procedures had been weakened, where an underprepared worker could be left to manage a situation he did not fully understand. In many disasters, the person nearest to the final switch becomes the face of the catastrophe, but often, the real failure has been built around them for years. By late afternoon, on March 9th, the ski day was coming to an end. The light was fading. People were tired, cold, and ready to descend. At the upper station, passengers gathered to board a cabin heading down toward Cavalese. Among them was a 14-year-old girl named Alessandra Piovesana, who was there on a school ski trip. Like the others, she had no reason to believe the ride would be anything but routine. The cabin was filled beyond its intended capacity. There were 43 people inside, including children. In a busy resort that may not have seemed shocking to the staff, the crowds had to be moved. The day was ending. A few extra passengers, especially when some were children, might have felt like a practical compromise rather than a serious danger. But disasters often depend on exactly that kind of compromise. Not one large obvious mistake, but a series of small allowances that quietly reduce the space between normal operation and catastrophe. The doors closed, and the cabin moved away from the station, and inside, people settled into the ride. Some looked out at the landscape. Some talked with friends. For a moment, the scene was almost peaceful. Then the cabin stopped. It was sudden enough to be noticed, but not necessarily enough to cause panic. Cable cars can stop. Ski lifts can pause. Mechanical systems sometimes hesitate. Passengers may feel a jolt, look around, make a nervous joke, and wait for the ride to continue. But this stop was not meaningless. Somewhere along the line, the cables had crossed or overlapped in a dangerous way, and the safety system had shut everything down. That stop was the system saying, "Do not continue until this is understood." In that moment, the disaster had not yet happened. 43 people were suspended in the air, but they were still alive. The machine had recognized danger before the final failure. In the control room, Carlo Schweitzer was faced with a situation he did not fully know how to handle. The line had stopped. Passengers were waiting. The pressure to restore movement would have been immediate. A stopped cable car is not an abstract problem. It means people hanging above a mountainside, other passengers delayed, operations interrupted, and everyone expecting the operator to act. Carlo reportedly sought guidance from another employee. The instruction he received was simple: restart the system. That instruction reflected the dangerous culture that had grown around the line. If stops had been overridden before, if the key had been used repeatedly, if alarms had become routine, then restarting may have felt like following workplace practice rather than violating a safety boundary. But this time, the situation was different. The cables were not merely touching. They were in a position where movement could turn a warning into a cutting force. When the line started again, the passengers inside the cabin may still not have understood what was happening. At first, the mood may have been confused, but not terrified. A sudden stop, a restart, a sway in the wind. These could be interpreted as uncomfortable but survivable. Above them, however, the machinery was entering a deadly state. The moving cable began grinding against the fixed support cable. These were not small parts inside a machine. They were massive steel lines under tremendous tension, carrying and pulling a loaded cabin high above the slope. When the moving cable rubbed against the support cable with force, it began to cut into it. The image is difficult to forget. Not a broken engine, not a missing bolt, but the system's own cable acting against the cable that held the passengers in the air. A machine designed to carry people safely down the mountain had become the thing destroying its own support. Another operator, Giorgio De Matteo, was in a separate cabin traveling in the opposite direction. From his position, he could see that something was terribly wrong. Sparks were coming from the cables. That detail alone reveals the violence of what was happening overhead. Steel was grinding against steel with enough force and heat to throw bright sparks into the cold mountain air. Giorgio tried to report it, but the communication system failed, and he was trapped in the awful position of a witness who understands danger before anyone with power can stop it. He could see the descending cabin continuing along the line. He could see the evidence of a catastrophic mechanical conflict, but he could not reach the people who needed to act. For roughly a minute and a half after the restart, the cables continued to tear into each other. 90 seconds can feel short when nothing is happening. It can feel endless when a disaster is forming above your head. For the passengers, those seconds may have contained confusion, nervous laughter, and then fear as the motion changed. For the steel cable, those seconds were enough. The moving cable cut deeper and deeper into the support cable until the support cable finally failed. When it snapped, the cabin was no longer suspended. It dropped. The fall lasted only a few seconds, but for anyone inside who understood what was happening, it must have felt impossibly long. The cabin plunged around 70 meters down the mountainside before hitting the slope. The impact was catastrophic. Glass shattered, metal twisted. Bodies were thrown against one another in a crushed space that had moments earlier been a passenger cabin. But even after the fall, the disaster was not finished. Because the system had been restarted and the stop had been overridden, the machinery did not immediately halt in the way it should have. The wrecked cabin was dragged across the ground by the still-moving cable. The heavy, overhead carriage assembly, weighing several tons, came down onto the cabin and crushed it further. This detail is one of the most horrifying parts of the Cavalese disaster, because it shows how the same failure continued to harm the passengers after the initial fall. Some victims died in the impact. Others may have survived the first moments, only to be trapped, crushed, or suffocated in the wreckage. A cable car that had fallen from the sky was then pulled across the mountain like debris caught in a machine that had lost all sense of the people inside it. On the mountainside, silence did not come immediately. Survivors of disasters often describe sound before they describe anything else. Metal settling, wind moving through broken glass, voices calling for help, people crying out for family members who cannot answer. Alessandra Piovesana was the only passenger who survived. She had been positioned in a part of the cabin that was less completely crushed, and the bodies around her helped shield her from the worst of the impact. That fact is almost unbearable. Her survival depended in part on the people who died around her. She was injured and trapped, surrounded by classmates, friends, and strangers, while rescuers worked their way toward the wreckage. Later, she would speak about the memory of those moments, the voices she heard, the people who slowly went quiet, and the terrible realization that she was alone among the dead. 42 people died in the disaster. 15 of them were children. Most had boarded the cable car for the simplest possible reason: they wanted to get down the mountain. They were not taking an unusual risk. They were not entering a dangerous expedition. They were using public transport at a ski resort, trusting that the hidden machinery had been maintained, operated, and respected by those responsible for it. That is one reason the disaster shocked Italy and Europe so deeply. Cable cars depend on public trust. The passenger gives up control completely. There is no steering wheel, no brake pedal, no exit door that can help if the system above fails. Once the cabin leaves the station, the people inside have only one protection: the competence of the system around them. At Cavalese, that system failed them. The investigation made the tragedy even more disturbing because it showed that this was not a mysterious accident that no one could have imagined. The basic chain became clear. The cable car had been carrying more people than its rated capacity. The line had been operated in ways that increased speed and stress. The cables had crossed or overlapped. The safety system stopped the line. Then that safety system was bypassed, allowing the machinery to continue while the cables were in a dangerous position. The moving cable cut the support cable. The cabin fell. Each part of the chain mattered, but the most important lesson was that the disaster was preventable. The warning had not been absent. It had been ignored. This is what separates a random accident from a systemic disaster. In a random accident, danger appears suddenly and leaves little chance to respond. In a systemic disaster, the clues are often present long before the final moment. Warnings are normalized. Rules are bent. Operators are undertrained. Equipment is pushed harder than intended. People begin to confuse repeated survival with safety. They tell themselves that because the system did not fail yesterday, it will not fail today. But mechanical systems do not care about habit. Steel does not care that an override has worked before. A support cable does not become stronger because a workplace has grown comfortable with shortcuts. Every time a warning is dismissed, the system may still function, but the margin of safety becomes thinner. Carlo Schweizer was later convicted, along with others connected to the operation of the cableway. For the families of the dead, accountability mattered. It had to matter. 42 people were gone, and the decisions that led to their deaths could not simply be excused as bad luck. At the same time, Carlo's role remained painful and complicated. He was the man who restarted the line. That fact cannot be softened. But he was also a young, undertrained seasonal worker operating inside a culture where overriding alarms had become routine. He did not create that culture alone. He did not design the system, set the operating priorities, normalize the shortcuts, or decide that inexperienced people should carry such responsibility. He was the final human link in a chain that had been assembled long before he touched the controls. In the years after the disaster, the town of Cavalese had to live with the memory of what happened on its mountain. Tourism eventually returned. Systems were rebuilt. Life continued, as it always does after public tragedies, not because people forget, but because a town cannot remain frozen forever. Yet for survivors, families, and those connected to the event, March 9th did not simply end. Alessandra carried the memory of the cabin for the rest of her life. Carlo carried the guilt and public blame for the rest of his. And the mountain itself became associated not only with beauty and skiing, but with the knowledge that 42 people had died there in a disaster that safety systems had tried to prevent. The first Cavalese Cable Car Disaster is remembered as the deadliest cable car crash in history, but its meaning is larger than a statistic. It is a warning about what happens when efficiency is allowed to quietly outrank safety. It is a warning about alarms that become background noise. It is a warning about putting unprepared workers into positions where one decision can decide the fate of dozens of people. And it is a warning about the dangerous comfort that comes from saying, "We have done this before." On that evening, in 1976, the people inside the descending cabin did not die because the mountain was cruel or because the weather suddenly turned against them. They died because a system that should have protected them had been weakened by habit, pressure, and neglect. There is a moment in this story that is almost impossible to move past. The cabin had stopped. The passengers were alive. The safety system had recognized the danger and acted. In another version of the evening, the line remains stopped. Trained technicians inspect the problem. The passengers are rescued or brought down safely. And March 9th becomes nothing more than a frightening delay at a ski resort. But that is not the version that happened. The line was restarted. The cables tore into each other. The support failed. And a quiet ride down from the mountain became a tragedy that would follow Cavalese for decades. Disasters often look sudden from a distance. A cable snaps, a cabin falls, people die. But when we look closely, the real story usually begins earlier. It begins with the first ignored warning, the first accepted shortcut, the first time someone says the rule does not matter because nothing bad happened last time. The Cavalese disaster did not begin when the support cable broke. It began when the people responsible for the system stopped treating danger as danger. And by the time the mountain finally forced them to understand the difference, it was already too late.